Among all the topsy-turvy changes that we've been experiencing since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, is the question that at least I keep hearing in my mind over and over again: what are we going to eat? From the sudden shortages of some food items at the beginning, when everyone seemed to be in kind of hurricane shopping mode, and just buying everything they could find on the shelves, from that to the close down of frequently visited restaurants, to the maddeningly repetitive question that is asked every day at 6 p.m. when you realize you're just staring at the refrigerator once again, just like the day before: what's for dinner? Well, maybe I should just own this for myself. It's regularly on my mind. That's kind of the question. Although I think I have sort of reached a kind of equilibrium where I don't worry about variety as so much, just whether or not there will be something to eat. And, I often find myself then asking, what's Helen going to make me for dinner? What are we going to eat? Of course, Helen is a great cook, and she always makes something great, something delicious. And obviously, she has not let me starve during this time of pandemic. One of the reasons that I think I might be thinking about food all the time is because Helen loves to watch cooking shows all the time. And one of her favorite shows is Guy's Grocery Games. That's where 3 different chefs run through a grocery store and grab a basket of ingredients and cook their own specialty in 30 minutes and then serve their special dishes to the panel of chef judges. We like to see the chef's creativity, and it's funny sometimes the challenges that Guy puts before them and the ingredients they can use. I don't know, maybe I was watching one of those shows recently, and that's what prompted me to think, smoked pulled pork would really be good to eat. That would really taste good. I think I'll go get some pork and smoke it. So I started off, I got my smoker and my supplies ready, and I told Helen I was going to the store to get some pork butts. And then I checked online first to see which stores would have them, and I found a meat market that had pork for sale. I don't usually go to that store, so it was a bit of an adventure for me. When I got there, I put my mask on and I grabbed a sanitized grocery cart and I headed through the aisles like I was on Guy's Grocery Games, looking for the ingredients to grab. And I found the pork I was looking for. There were just a few of them left, just a couple. So I grabbed them and I headed to the cashier. I was in and out of that store in just a couple of minutes, and I was feeling pretty satisfied with myself as I drove home, thinking how good that smoked pulled pork was going to taste when I finally had it all done and ready. On the way home, I was listening to NPR. I think it was Weekend Edition, when I realized that they were reporting on the global hunger and food crisis that was being caused by the pandemic. They had interviews from different countries and the situations they were facing there around the world. And all of a sudden I realized I was listening to a report on the hunger and food crisis in Lebanon. And they said, here's a story, we've verified this story, and they began to tell it. The story about a man who had been robbed at gunpoint as he was walking down the street in the middle of the day. The robber demanded all of his money and his wallet. The man quickly complied and handed them over to the robber, and the robber snatched them and started to run away. But then the robber stopped. He turned around and he came back to the man, and the robber was now weeping. The robber gave the man back his money and his wallet, and he was just apologizing profusely. He said, I don't have any food at all for my wife and my children, nothing at all for them, and I didn't know what else to do. This is not who I am. And he cried as he begged the man he had just robbed to forgive him. I was listening and thinking about how terrible that situation must have been. But honestly, it took a few minutes for it to really sort of sink in. It took a few minutes for me to hear that and remember that I was driving home with a big bag of pork that I was going to cook and then divide up and freeze in little Ziploc baggies so that I could pull them out of the freezer whenever I felt like it. And it was going to last a nice long time. And I felt an urge, a sort of emptiness in my stomach that made me think I should just turn around and take that pork back to the store. How could I have so much when someone else had so little? But you know, there are ways that we find to rationalize and quell urges like that, and I found some, and I kept driving home. Still, I haven't completely found anything to satisfy the emptiness prompted by hearing that news story. I can tell you this. Eating the pork, which I cooked, I enjoyed. But eating it doesn't do it. It hasn't quelled that emptiness prompted by that story. What do you do when there is enduring hunger and emptiness? It seems important that we acknowledge our context, situation in which we are hearing the stories from the Bible, and specifically our context today as we read this story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Last I read, our political leaders are still unable to reach an agreement, so that there is still no governmental action to provide and extend assistance to people in need during this pandemic. And according to one report I heard, that means there were 40 million people living in households with children that were food deprived as of this weekend. And the numbers will rise in the weeks ahead. What do we do when there is enduring hunger and emptiness? We're going to collect food again this week here at the church for the Washington Shores Food Pantry. We've boosted the number of times that we've been doing that, and you've been giving very, very generously. Lots of you showing up with lots of food supplies to take over. But next month, they're going to need more food. Next week, they're going to need more food. And I'm sure next week we'll have more than we need, and I'm sure that we'll give generously again. And we may still be left with an enduring hunger and emptiness that we aren't even sure how to quell within ourselves. I'm struck by how the gospel writers put this miracle story of Jesus feeding a crowd of more than 5,000 immediately following, side by side, with the story of the death of John the Baptist. You probably remember how Herod threw a large banquet, and he was so smitten by the daughter of Herodias and her dance that he promised that she could have anything that she wanted. And so she asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Herod couldn't back down in front of all those guests that he invited to his banquet. So he had John beheaded and served up on a platter to the girl. Now there's a contrast between that banquet and what's happening there and the banquet which will take place next, which we read of just a few minutes ago. Jesus' disciples came and they told Jesus that his friend, his cousin, John the Baptist, had been killed by Herod, and the heaviness of that news prompts Jesus to get in a boat and try and get away by himself to a deserted place. And you can understand why, of course. How do you handle news like that? What do you do with grief? But the crowds follow Jesus. The crowds who had heard of Jesus' miraculous healings and his powerful teachings, the crowds always seeking, always looking, always hungry for something, for help, for guidance, for food. They come again looking for Jesus. Matthew says, when Jesus came ashore and saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. The word phrase, had compassion, isn't used a lot in the Gospels. It's used in each of the stories of Jesus feeding large crowds. It's used a couple other times. Jesus has compassion on the father whose son has just died. But that word, compassion, is also used by Luke in two very familiar parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan and the parable of the prodigal son. The Samaritan sees the wounded man lying on the road, and he has compassion on him. And he acts. He puts the man on his donkey and takes him to the inn to be treated. The father sees the prodigal son walking up the road to return home, and even though the son is a long way off, the father is filled with compassion for him, and he runs up the road to hug him and to kiss him. There's a depth of feeling in this compassion, an identification with the other that seems to drive a person to do something, to respond to another person, to help in some way. A depth of feeling that comes up from your innermost being as though it's a remembering of who you are in the very essence of your character and who the other person is in the essence of theirs. There's a crowd and Jesus has compassion on them. Jesus had withdrawn, gotten in a boat, and pushed away from the shore to seek a deserted place where maybe he was going to pour his heart out in prayer, his grief at John's death. But the crowds seek him out, bringing their need. When Jesus comes ashore, he sees the great crowd, and he has compassion on them and cures their sick. Is it enough? The disciples recognize what's going to be needed next. It's not enough in their minds. It's late and the crowd will now need something to eat. Send the crowd away into the villages, they tell Jesus, so they can buy food for themselves. But Jesus says, that's not necessary. You do it. You give them something to eat. How in the world could that be possible? I think it's interesting that when Jesus says that to the disciples don't say back to Jesus, they don't respond, no, it's not our job. We didn't sign up to be the gravy train for everybody. That's not our job, is it? We're supposed to be fishers of people, not a food service. And the disciples didn't say back to Jesus, Jesus, it's not a good idea. If we feed this crowd, they will just start to think that we can do that sort of thing all the time, and they'll become dependent on us. We can't create dependency. It's not a good idea. The disciples didn't even say back to Jesus, look, we don't want to do it. We're tired. It's late. We've done our share. Send them away. And the disciples didn't say any of those things. What the disciples said was, we don't have enough. We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's just not enough, Jesus. Jesus said, bring the loaves and the 2 fish to me. He prayed over them, he broke them, and he gave the loaves and the fish back to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowd, and then everybody ate. And everybody was filled, 5,000 men, plus women and children. Nobody was food deprived that day. And when everybody was filled, there was bread and fish left over, 12 baskets full. Did you ever wonder, was it enough? Was it going to be enough tomorrow? I wonder what the disciples thought when that day was over. Did they think to themselves, where in the world did all that bread and fish come from? Some people say it was a miraculous multiplication of loaves and fishes. Some people say the miracle was that when Jesus sat down and when Jesus prayed, they began to share with one another what they had already brought and kept for themselves, maybe under their cloaks, but now they were beginning to just give to one another, moved perhaps by some of the things that Jesus said. Some people say maybe it was really just a miraculous change of heart. I wonder if the disciples thought, is it enough? Whatever Jesus did, everyone ate their fill that day. They probably were filled for the first time in a long time. These were not wealthy people. It would have been unlikely, an uncommon luxury for all those people to have so much to eat. But on this day, because of Jesus, they ate their fill. But what about tomorrow? Wouldn't the crowd get hungry again tomorrow? Was the crowd just going to stand there looking at the disciples and saying over and over, "Feed us, feed us"? Would Jesus turn and say to the disciples again tomorrow, you give them something to eat? Would the disciples have said, we don't have enough? We don't have enough. Even 12 baskets of leftovers won't last very long. Maybe breakfast tomorrow, but we don't have enough. There's a way, it seems to me, in which the abundance that Jesus provides, food for everyone to eat their fill in this moment, contrasts and highlights with an enduring emptiness and hunger. Everybody ate their fill that day. But last week, one man was robbing another in Lebanon because he didn't have anything for his wife and children and didn't know what else to do. And Jesus repeats a command, a challenge, over and over and over again. You give them something to eat. There's a way in which Jesus' command, Jesus' challenge, forces us back to Jesus with an awareness of our own emptiness and hunger, because we don't really know where help will come from if it doesn't come from Him. Lord, we don't have enough. Do you? There's a way in which Jesus' command, Jesus' challenge, forces us to an awareness of our emptiness and our hunger. Because over time, looking around at our lives today, we realize we found lots of different ways to rationalize and quell the uneasiness within us as we look at what we do have and say to ourselves on the way home from the grocery store, well, it's not really enough to matter, and those other people are far away, and it's just news of something that happened somewhere else already a few weeks ago. Jesus said, you give them something to eat, but that's an old Bible story, an old Bible story from a long time ago. You give them something to eat. Do we have enough, Lord? Is there enough? Our country celebrated this week the life of one whom I think, as many do, is a national hero, John Lewis. It was moving to hear the former presidents, Clinton, Bush, and Jimmy Carter, and Barack Obama, remember Lewis with such affection, thinking about their friendship with him. I especially liked what President Obama said at John Lewis's memorial service this past week, how 20 years from now, 50 years from now, maybe even a century from now, when we finally form a more perfect human union, John Lewis will be one of its founding fathers. Why? Because he kept marching, he kept protesting nonviolently, he kept pushing, he kept speaking up, he kept getting into good trouble, as he called it. I have to wonder what it was that kept him going, kept him moving forward, kept him always ready and willing to march. Wonder if it was those words of Jesus. you give them something to eat. In an amazing thing, Lewis had written an essay which was published in the New York Times the day of his memorial service. And there are powerful thoughts, powerful words that he expresses as he calls us to continue to shape and seek a more perfect union, a more perfect life together. Lewis wrote, "If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what so readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and her best, shooting unwitting concert-goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McCain." Lewis seemed to recognize and acknowledge and confront the enduring emptiness and hunger within us. He went on to describe the journey of his own life and why it was he felt compelled to respond to that hunger and emptiness. He said, "Like so many people, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in, and then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said we're all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said it's not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said each of us has a moral obligation to stand up and speak out. When you see something that's not right, you must say something," Lewis wrote. "You must do something. Democracy is not a state, it's an act. And each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and a world, a society at peace with itself." And then Lewis concluded, "Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I've done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it's your turn to let freedom ring. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide." Lewis's last words to us. And I believe he spoke those words, he wrote those words, because he was continuing to hear day by day the voice of Jesus say, "You give them something to eat." We come to this table today. We gather at tables wherever you are, with an enduring emptiness and hunger. And we know that it will only be filled when we hear the voice of Jesus say again, "You give them something to eat." And we feel the Spirit moving within us to compassion and to love. The wind of the Spirit